Our second panel today is titled The Path to Compliance. Here we'll discuss the realities of implementing the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program. The format will be the same. We'll have each of the panelists address the question for 3 to 5 minutes, and then I will direct a Q&A with the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the panel 2 speakers. I regret to tell you that Senator Michael Rubio is tied up in committee and will not be able to join us this morning. Mr. Tim Olson, the Manager of Transportation Energy Office for the California Energy Commission. Ms. Dorothy Rothrock is Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. Mr. Timothy O'Connor is Director of California Climate Energy Initiative for the Environmental Defense Fund. And Mrs. Kathy Rehaves Boyd is President, Western States Petroleum Association. Now, with that, I'd like to ask Tim Olson to begin the discussion.
Thanks for the introduction. Just want to make a couple of points here before we get into the questions. I represent an agency, California Energy Commission, that has a polyfuel outlook on the future, that we think that there are lots of options. In fact, the polyfuel approach is really based on addressing multiple policy objectives, some existing legislation, some policies, some regulations, some executive orders. That multiple group of objectives is centered on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As many of us know, low carbon fuel standard is one of those. AB 32 program, ZEV mandate. Our other significant goal that we see is petroleum displacement. We think that this state, relying on 94% of our fuel from one source, is not a good approach, that we would like to see some diversity in what the transportation sector could offer. And we know that that some of that could come from developing domestic in-state resources. We think that is likely to be some source of biofuels. So we have another objective, that's our bioenergy action plan. And in the transportation part of that, got a quantified goal that we're going to try to reach from domestic in-state production plants. So the way we look at the implementation of a low carbon fuel standard is really looking at the implementation of a whole host of other policies, other laws, other executive orders. And so how do we go about doing that at the Energy Commission? What do we add to that? Well, we do our own scenario work. Quite often we're sharing that in conjunction with ARB. Our approach going into the future is going to be greater transparency in how we develop that, how we make assumptions. What has been missed in the last few years is a need to engage the outside world in a greater way. Information on where the projects are going to occur, if they're biofuels, information on where vehicles are going to be sold from automakers, where the infrastructure is needed, if infrastructure is needed. We also, our agency also puts money into the investment in these areas, approximately $100 million a year. We've got a track record so far where we've shown some results in meeting those goals. They're not well publicized, they're documented, they're not well publicized. Our approach over the next 6 months will be to publicize those accomplishments and achievements. What we're seeing is in the first round of funding, about $200 million, is we're seeing market penetration of 1 to 4% of those goals that are set, targeted. The petroleum displacement goals, the greenhouse gas emission goals, the bioenergy action plan, biofuel goals. We also are taking on another role of facilitating the development of those projects. And that means going beyond what government incentives can add, and that's looking at the financing and how these projects are going to get on the ground. Our $100 million a year isn't enough to cover what really is, by 2020, about a $100 billion investment. And we think that can be achieved, and it's going to take some creative process on how to use government incentives to attract private investment. Just from the implementation of the low carbon fuel standard, sum up in a thumbnail. We think that electric vehicles and hydrogen will add, based on the ZEV mandate goals, it'll be about 1% of the total vehicles in 2020. We think in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and efficiency of that vehicle, it could account for 1.5% to 2% of the greenhouse gas emission reduction target for low carbon fuel standard. What is that based on? Efficiency of the vehicle is about 3 to 4 times a gasoline vehicle. We think natural gas will, which now is 1% of the medium duty, heavy duty market, 17% of all transportation fuels in the state. We think that could double or quadruple by 2020. What's the evidence there? Pretty significant market penetration, still subsidized right now, but market penetration in several different vehicle class, medium duty, heavy duty. Where do we see the balance of that? Probably from biofuels. The Energy Commission's made investments in 27 projects in the state. We think that there's probably at least 600 million gallons of gasoline equivalent that could be biofuel sources. That's a lower carbon. All these projects will take probably 3 to 5 years before they're commercial scale. Some of them 2016, 2017. We think most of them are going to be online by 2020. So when you add that up, we think that there's a plausible strategy on how to fulfill the low carbon fuel standard.
Okay, Senator Rubio has been able to join us, so I'd like to invite him up to the stage as well, and we'll allow him to make his comments.
Hey, thanks a lot. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to participate in a very important subject, and forgive me for being a bit tardy. There are a number of committee hearings across the street. I would like to say good work being done, but I seriously doubt it. Which is a great segue into talking about the issue before us today. But it is very important, and I am very excited that all of you are coming together in the forum of today in this symposium, encouraging members of the legislature to come over, be better informed, better educated on this subject, because I must tell you, I'm a bit baffled. As a young man, I grew up in a little town called Lost Hills. Some of you know where that is. It is lost but no hills, right off of I-5. But I had the unique opportunity to have a backyard that included a whole bunch of oil wells. In fact, I ran through them during cross-country quite often. And so understanding the dynamics of the energy and the fuels of tomorrow is something that I take very seriously, because representing the southern San Joaquin part of the Central Valley, the issues of oil and gas are front and center because it's a homegrown advantage for us. I like to joke with my more liberal colleagues in the Democratic caucus and say we're the best recyclers on earth. We recycle dinosaurs. But when you look at what the legislature is doing today, it is not bringing all of you to the table to find a solution to something that, whether you agree or don't agree, is something we're going to try to wrestle with, and that's global warming. And so when you look at the low carbon fuel standard, what baffles me the most, to take back what I started with, is one, why are we telling other states how to do something and then take a position that it's not a violation of the Commerce Clause? I don't get it. I just can't calculate it. Second, if we look at well to will or seed to will, then why don't we look at producing in our state again? And what do I mean by that? Many of you here have a pen that you're writing with right now, correct? Well, odds are that you have a little bit of Kern crude oil in that pen to lubricate the ball so that you can write with it. But we don't produce pens anymore. So we produce the commodity in the great town of Bakersfield. We then truck it or put it on a train to some other state that produces the pens, and then we truck it all the way back to the consumers here in California. That can't be green. But yet we are forcing and requiring all of you to find some way to reduce your carbon footprint from well to will with no consideration, with absolutely no idea of how it's going to impact us in the long run. And what I get most frustrated and baffled by is that we all argue that we want to support poor people, folks who don't have a voice. And as a Democrat, I know you couldn't tell that by my opening remarks, I am a Democrat, an old-time Democrat, where the best hand you get in life is the one at the end of your sleeve. But what I don't appreciate is putting forth policies that will increase the cost of a fuel where more than likely middle-class to lower-middle-class citizens are paying the increase in costs to somehow meet the agenda of someone who wants to claim they are being green, when in reality, we can find a far more efficient, far more effective way in reducing carbon emissions, creating jobs, and moving the state forward as the leader and the juggernaut vis-a-vis AB 32. That's why I've taken a firm position that the low carbon fuel standard needs to be redesigned. We need to get back to the table, find a way to accomplish the wonderful intent of the low carbon fuel standard, rather than spending hard-earned tax dollars to argue and defend this program all the way, let's face it, to the U.S. Supreme Court, which if you look at the court makeup today, they are going to strike it down because of the Commerce Clause. So I look forward to engaging in this conversation and dialogue with each of you in this room, and then taking it back and hopefully accomplishing something in that white building across the way. So thank you again for inviting me.
Senator, thank you. Ms. Rothrock?
Thank you, and I was planning to be the most fired up member of this panel, but I think I've just been outdone, so I'll calm down. I represent the manufacturers in California, and spinning off Senator Rubio's comment about not producing things here in the state, I'd like to talk broadly about manufacturing in light of a lot of costs that are coming down from AB 32, including but of course not limited to the low carbon fuel standard. It's extraordinarily important that when we're implementing AB 32 and all the policies associated with it, that we maintain and can sustain a productive economy, because it's a lie if we don't. We won't be able to show the world that it can be done if we can't do it ourselves. If we outsource our manufacturing, outsource our production, that means we're turning into the Rome of the current century, where the provinces are doing all the hard work and we're simply the wealthy people that are buying all the products from the provinces, and we're claiming ourselves to be clean and pure, but yet we've simply exported our emissions to other locations, along with jobs that of course we need here. So it's not just LCFS. Right now we pay electricity costs that are about 50% higher than the national average. We're looking at huge hits coming from cap and trade, including an auction that we believe is unnecessary and illegal. So manufacturers are seeing a lot of costs coming down the road, and if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to attend the CMTA Manufacturing Summit on June 28th. That's coming up just next week. We have a comprehensive new study about the costs of AB 32 and other climate policies associated with it, and we encourage you to visit and hear more about the details, because it's coming down upon us, and manufacturers who make plans 3 or 4 years at least out into the future are seeing those costs and making decisions today whether or not they're going to expand here. I just want to share a PowerPoint with y'all. Let me describe it. It shows that between 1977 and 2000, New and expanded manufacturing investment happened in California at a rate at about 5.6% of the U.S. as a whole. So that's not too bad. Not great, but 5.6%, that's fine. Since 2001, we've only enjoyed an average of 1.9% of U.S. manufacturing investment. So we're seeing this decline. You'll see it's rather lumpy up and down with the business cycle, but it's just completely flatlining now since 2001, and we don't see that getting any better from here on out, so long as manufacturers see these tremendous costs coming down upon us. So I challenge our environmental friends, one of the best ones right here to my right, to say, how is it that we're going to show the rest of the world that this is a good idea if we're not maintaining our manufacturing base?
Okay. Mr. O'Connor?
I don't know what he was planning to say, but
One of the good ones.
this is what I want to hear.
That's quite a transition. And hopefully I'll cover that in my remarks. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. Environmental Defense Fund is a national nonprofit organization. We've been working here in California for over 2 decades. I personally have been here in Sacramento since AB 32 passed, and I feel invested in this work like many of you because I originally was working on the low carbon fuel standard, before it was adopted. I've written many comment letters, and even before that I was a refinery inspector with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, inspecting towers and power plants and refineries, and trying to sort of figure out how all these policies fit together is something that I think that's why I was brought to EDF, because EDF takes a larger view at how do these policy solutions that the state is passing, that we're forwarding, how do they work to inspire new opportunity? How do businesses work? How is the incentive placed to innovate and to reduce emissions? My wife tells me that when I get to attend things like this that I'm pretty privileged. I told her that actually I was going in between a manufacturer and a refiner, so I said, I don't know if it's a privilege, but she said, actually, in California, because she's from Florida, she says, you get to talk about how to reduce emissions, not whether emissions should be reduced at all. And that really is a privilege to us. And I think that we all do agree that the end result needs to be reduced emissions. It needs to be responsible action. It needs to be getting back to the levels that AB 32 said. And I think that even though the legislators in the Capitol, many of them were not there when AB 32 was passed, they would all agree that we do need a firm commitment to reduce emissions because climate change is a problem that's facing our generation and will face the generations of the future. So how does that get to California's approach and compliance with the LCFS today? Well, we have a number of policies in the state that are trying to drive innovative technology, vehicles, fuels, infrastructure. The AB 118 program is one that is a grant-based program, and that it needs to be a part of the solution, but that can't be the only solution. We can't just throw state money at it and expect to get the solutions that are really going to bring us to the 21st century low-carbon future. We need innovative policies that inspire innovation and hold businesses' feet to the fire to reduce emissions and to figure out how to do so cost-effectively so we can transition our economy in a way that doesn't impair the overall economy. And the LCFS and the cap and trade program and really the PAVLI standards, they're market-based programs that do that. They don't dictate the path to the result, they dictate the result, and they let the regulated entities figure out how to do that in a way that's the most cost-effective. And compliance really is not a short-term issue. We can look at this year, we can look at next year, but really climate change is a long-term problem and we need a long-term solution. We need a diversified fuel mix. We need increased efficiency at our facilities. We need increased domestic fuel sources, and we need to reduce our combustion of fuels that burden our air and cause our children to get sick and give them asthma. Last time I checked, we have at least 32 counties in California that still were out of attainment for federal health ozone standards, and that's something we need to fix. Now, the LCFS is going to help drive that result. Policies that get at fuels that have decreased criteria pollutant emissions, that is going to be part of it. And those policies and those solutions are coming to the surface. Right now we have over 100 different fuel pathways that are certified in California to provide lower carbon fuel than the current fuel mix so that compliance with the LCFS can be driven today. We're already seeing overcompliance with the fuel standard result. Second, we have audits in California facilities that are showing that our big manufacturing facilities are on average having 16 to 17% improvements in their efficiency that are documented right now. We need policies that will drive us to implementing those solutions. And in fact, when you look at where California refineries are, we are 16 to 33% more energy intensive than similarly situated refineries in other states. We need to reduce emissions, and we need policies that will stimulate that innovation. And with respect to Senator Rubio, there are policies, or there are opportunities in his district that have been deployed to make incremental improvements in the fuel system that we have today. There's a company called GlassPoint. GlassPoint developed these greenhouses that you can use ultra lightweight material, which is less expensive and can be deployed in a smaller footprint to provide steam through the sun to help steam out oil wells that would otherwise be using natural gas or coal to get that fuel out of the ground. Those types of policies are not ones, or those types of solutions not going to be forwarded unless we have a price on pollution, unless we drive the policy forward and we inspire companies to search out, to find them, and to get rewarded by the reductions that are possible. And finally, with regard to the lawsuit, EDF is a participant in the Low Carbon Fuel Standard lawsuit. And last week, we saw 7 different amicus briefs come to the table in support of the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, in support of California. A couple of us were talking specifically to the issue of the Dormant Commerce Clause. We had a number of law professors from around the country weigh in on this issue and said, when we put a price on pollution, when we inspire reductions, when we inspire a reduced fuel mix, we don't violate the Commerce Clause just because there's an incentive out there to get other states and other companies in other states to come forward. What we get are smart solutions. We had policy experts, we had climate scientists, we saw experts in LCA all come to the table and say, this is a smart idea for California. And with respect to electricity costs, I think it's a one-sided argument to say we have the highest electricity costs, or some of the highest electricity costs in the nation. We have actually some of the lowest electricity bills in the nation because of policies just like California's environmental policies that are on the books today that are driving us to higher efficiency and reduced emissions. And when you look at California manufacturing, we have some of the most efficient manufacturing facilities in the nation, and when you look at all the charts, that will go to show that these policies are working and we need to drive them forward as opposed to taking a step back. Thank you.
Mr. O'Connor, thank you.
When do I get to rebut his comments?
Yeah, in the question period we can talk. Ms. Boyd?
Well, thank you, Kathy Rice-Boyd, and I'm President of Western States Petroleum Association. We cover 6 states. California is certainly our largest, and we represent the refiners and the producers and the marketers and transporters of fuel, and including not only transportation fuels, but obviously other forms of energy as well. First of all, I'd just like to thank Senator Rubio for joining us, and also for Fueling California. This is just a really great event. It's great to see a lot of friends out there, a lot of new faces, but it's just a great testament to the interest, I think, in this topic. It's also, I think, really important that we continue this conversation that we're having. It's really important for us to understand the implications of these regulations that, in our opinion, in particular, will be coming upon the refining sector in California at the same time, and will have some ramifications associated with that. And so it's very important for us to have a conversation with others about that. And every time we do that, not only do we learn different things because they look through a different lens than we do, but vice versa. And hopefully that conversation will really yield these alternatives that the Senator pointed to as well. We do recognize that California has and will continue to have a leadership role in climate change. We're not debating that, and nothing that really I have to say today is to elicit any conversation or discussion about the validity of our need to address climate change. So we're not questioning the need on the fact that we need to address it. We are committed partners in reducing climate change, and I can tell you I personally have been involved from day one, from AB 32's implementation and then following the Low Carbon Fuel Standard adoption. But I always like to remind people, you know, there's 38 million people in the state of California. We are the 3rd largest consumer in the world, and the only ones ahead of us are the United States and China. And we consume 2 million gallons of gasoline and diesel every hour in this state. We're the fourth largest producer. We were the third, but North Dakota's jumped up ahead of us in natural gas, so I think we're the fourth now as a state. So we're pretty important in this conversation. One thing we took away from one of the California Air Resources board members, Sandy Berg, during the adoption of these regulations that was very insightful, and that is the Air Resources Board looks at these regulations one at a time as they come online, and they have debates about them, and then we adopt them and we go on. But never have we stepped back and looked at the cumulative impacts of these regulations on one sector. And we took that comment that she made as very important and embarked on doing that. And so at lunch today, you will hear Brad Van Tassel with the Boston Consulting Group, who we have commissioned to look at this, to research it, to analyze it, and for the first time to really do it in a different way. Before we asked Brad to do this, we as an industry certainly looked at the costs associated with these regs. And there's the four I'll point to. One is the low carbon fuel standard. The second is cap and trade. The third is moving fuels under the cap and trade program. And the fourth is something called the Clean Fuels Outlet, which is really directed at putting hydrogen stations at retail. And when we looked at just the cost side of those four regulations, they're pretty large. Each of them have significant costs within the same period of 2013 to 2020. And so when you add those up, it's a pretty big number. And what that pointed to us was, okay, that's fine. We know now it's a very expensive proposition, but what does that really mean to California? How will the refining sector, how will the refiners themselves in this state behave and react to that? And then what impact will that have on the market, and is that important, and does it matter, and should we be talking about it? So I'm not going to tell you any of the results of that, because I'll leave that to Brad for the lunch conversation, but really our purpose of doing this study was to embark on what I'm calling a continued conversation. It's certainly not a new one, but it's new in the context of this information coming out on the impacts, and to engage all of the stakeholders, including the governor's office, the legislature, the environmental community, the labor community, the business community, the media, to really discuss what are we going to do going forward. We aren't saying that this is going to be a disaster tomorrow. We're not saying that the sky is falling today. We're talking about this now because we have time, not a lot of time, but we have some time. In my opinion, we have 2013 to sort of figure this out, because in 2015 and 16, things begin to happen, and those things are not good. And so what we're looking for in this conversation is there some other alternatives we should be looking at? We have commissioned a second study, which is lagging about a month. It'll be out in about 4 weeks, and we'll be interested in engaging the same people we've engaged over the last 2 days, and that has included the Air Resources Board, who we discussed yesterday, the governor's office, the Democratic legislative folks yesterday, and then we'll be briefing the business community and some of the labor folks this afternoon. And then we'll enter with the Energy Commission later this afternoon as well. And all of that is just, again, to start a conversation, to share this information. We're being very transparent about it. We're offering Brad's services to anyone who wants to call him and dig in deeper to the assumptions being made. If we've done wrong on the assumptions or we've mischaracterized them, we're very interested in knowing that. But it's going to be a very open and honest conversation about the impacts, and then also what alternatives are out there that we can look at that reduce the climate change, make our emission reductions, but do it in a more cost-effective manner that doesn't have what we see some serious market implications associated with it. So I think that's, I guess one other comment I'll make as far as the process that we went through to develop the regulations. I was very frustrated, especially with the low carbon fuel standard, to see the 8 scenarios that we ended up putting together for determining whether we could actually comply with the low carbon fuel standard. And as I dug into those, which I did, and looked at every eight of them, I couldn't really find one that was very realistic. And so what we end up setting up for ourselves is scenarios that aren't realistic, and then we all get together and talk about how we disagree and go backwards and how we have to fix them all. It would be nice to put a scenario in place that is realistic and then talk about innovative ways to make it more, our ability to actually enhance our chance of success of achieving it. So I don't know why we always do that. We always seem to do it backwards from what we need to be doing to really design a system that works. My biggest fear, and some of the previous panel members spoke to this, is the consumer and the public. I've said this many times, and I spoke on this topic ad nauseum, I think, for the past 5 years. But in my opinion, the consumer is really going to be the ultimate judge of the success of this program, because their expectations are very high. They wake up every day and they plan to drive from A to B, heat and cool their homes, and turns their lights on affordably and without interruption. And if we think what will happen in 2015 and 16, if we're even close to what we think is going to happen, it puts the whole program in jeopardy, because you have a black cloud over a program that's probably very meritorious when you look out to a 2050 timeframe, but that'll never see that because we'll never get there, because the impacts will be so huge that the public will just turn off. And then we won't have a program. We'll be starting over. So I think the sustainability of the program in the long term is at stake in the short term, and we've got to find a way to bridge that gap between what we see coming up in this 2015 time period and how we get over that and can go forward in a way that doesn't impact the refining sector, keeps the refining capacity in this state, keeps those high-paying manufacturing jobs that Dorothy talked about remaining here, and not having some unintended consequences that none of us envisioned when we wrote this program way back when. These are things that have evolved through our knowledge base being improved, and things like Brad will talk about coming to surface will make it a more informed discussion going forward. And I'm always optimistic that we can design a program for the state that works. The program that we have right now, whether you're talking low carbon fuel standard, trade exposure for refiners, or fuels under the cap, or the clean fuels outlet, is just not designed in a manner that we think is sustainable.
Thank you. I'd like to follow a few things that you said with a question that says, in general, what's your current opinion regarding the feasibility of implementing the low carbon fuel standard under the existing schedule and timeline, and what are the major obstacles, to compliance? And I'll throw that out to the entire panel.
Well, I can just start with the main one, of course, is the timeline of when cellulosic ethanol is going to be available to blend in our fuel, because it's the only thing that we know that will have the lowest carbon intensity that allows us to comply. In the early years, which we are now, and you heard Richard talk about this, the reason people aren't screaming about the low carbon fuel standard is it's what's called back-end loaded. We have very low percentages that we have to blend in our fuel now to comply, and those ramp up over time, and when they ramp up to a higher percentage rate in the 2015, 2016, sometimes earlier, 2014, depending time frame, there really isn't anything available for us to comply, to blend in our fuels to comply. We've exhausted exhausted Midwest corn-based ethanol. We've exhausted sugarcane, Brazilian ethanol, which has a lower CI, and then that gets you partway up your compliance pathway, and then again, there is just nothing else available. You certainly see it on the federal side with the RFS2 standard. We're way behind on our cellulosic volumes, and so we see a real problem in that time period on what's going to happen. And then Brad will talk about what we think, how the refiners will react as a result of that.
Anybody else? Tim?
I agree, Kathy, that it is going to be not an easy compliance pathway, and that I think that the cellulosic issue is probably the biggest issue facing the standard. The pathways that the Air Resources Board put out for their compliance scenarios had a significant volume of cellulosic ethanol in there, and unless and until we see those developed on a national level, it's going to be hard to envision those volumes coming to California. The benefit of the fuel standard, though, is that it allows for fuel producers in California to go out and find fuels that are the lowest carbon intensity, and so that they can go and preferentially purchase them. So it's not a mandate that you have to go buy fuel X or fuel Y. It's, go out and find the fuel that fits for you, or bring in the fuel that has the lowest carbon intensity. Similarly, there's no mandate that there's 1 million electric vehicles that come in. That sort of comes in through other regulations. And so hopefully we'll see the investment in that infrastructure that's needed to happen, because you can't just discover the fuel of tomorrow on some lab bench and then produce 2 billion gallons of it or 1 billion gallons of it and overnight. It's going to require some significant investment. And if we had the level of investment that's given to other types of fuel sources, like how much we spend every year finding new wells in the Gulf, or developing new oil wells, in foreign nations, or even here in California, hopefully we'd see a lot more development in that infrastructure that's needed in order to meet the compliance. We don't think it's unachievable, and if we thought it was unachievable, we wouldn't keep pushing it. But at the same time, we do think it's not going to be an easy compliance trajectory, especially if we don't get the level of investment that's needed to make it happen.
Thank you, Mr. O'Connor. Senator Rubio?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult to implement for the following reasons. Primarily because I would respectfully disagree with my great colleague Tim over here from the Environmental Defense Fund. This is dictating the path. And let me tell you where the path leads us. It leads us to Brazil. When the technology is not there and you must buy the ethanol to blend then with the fuel, and the only place in town that has it is Brazil, then you're going to ship it in from Brazil, and the net outcome will not be reducing greenhouse gases. More importantly, when we're not building the biofuel facilities in California because the policies and the laws we've passed in Sacramento do not encourage them in the state of California, then you're not producing the jobs, you're not locally producing the fuel to blend then with the fuel that you're refining in our state. Primarily, I will tell you, even if we did, even if you found the technology tomorrow, right? Some very, very smart kid out of Fresno, California invented it. We were then going to build the plant to produce it. Because of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, it would take you probably 8 years to site, permit, and move that plant forward. That does not allow for industry or the environmentalists or us people, those who truly believe in reducing and meeting AB 32. It does not provide the environment in which we can meet the time frame. So the policies, the laws, they do not assist us. And if we need funding to make investments in this particular area, I know where you can find one pot of money. Let's go take the hydrogen highway and the money that we want to spend on that, which, by the way, is going to force poor people to subsidize the very, very wealthy people in Marin County who want to drive their hydrogen automobile. This is where I think we all agree that we need to meet the AB 32 standard. How we get there is critically important. And now we are moving, rather than setting the goal and setting the finish line, if you will, we are clearly dictating the path. And that's not where we succeed. The great things like the Pavley tailpipe emission standard and all these other great programs that have worked for the state and made us the environmental champion in the country and in the world, we're veering from that path now. And I would argue, you want to look at the southern San Joaquin Valley, the extreme non-attainment. I can't even burn in an open fireplace anymore. We have the strictest air emission standards. We try to move a simple bill for carbon sequestration, which is supported by environmental groups and the industry. We can't get even that passed. That would be the single greatest job creator, but more importantly, reduction in greenhouse gases today. And we can't get that passed. So, let's just be honest with with one another here. The policies are not in line with the goals in which we are setting, and that's where we need to get back to the table. We need to roll up our sleeves, because there is I believe, a true effort and a desire for us to reach those goals.
Thank you. This question I'd like to direct. You want to respond?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just wanted to kind of reiterate my first comment, in that we do think that there are options to comply with the low carbon fuel standard. And just to kind of reiterate, this comment about cellulosic ethanol, we agree that's a longer term process. There are projects underway. One of the business models is to feed that into the existing commercial corn plants. One project will be ribbon cutting this next week to start that process. But there are other feedstocks that are not cellulosic, but they are low carbon. They are 80% reduction below gasoline on the grams of CO2 per megajoule. The Energy Commission's made investments in that with private industry. That to date has totaled $140 million. Most of these projects are in the Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. Some of those feedstocks are corn ethanol, there's grain sorghum, sweet sorghum, sugar beets. We think sugar cane in Imperial Valley is another option, and we think that some waste stream biofuels are options. From organic waste, from biomethane and dairies. These are prospects that can be online by 2016, 2017. What are the challenges to that? Capital investment when they go from the pilot projects where they are now, pre-commercial, to the $100 million, $200, $250 million investments. We are talking to investors now about how they see that market evolving and where they can make the money on that. It's still a challenge. Some technical things have to be proven, and that investment flow has to be well defined. We agree with Senator Rubio's comment about the permitting has to be streamlined, not to undercut CEQA, but to basically do things, maybe programmatic EIRs where the process is more defined for multiple projects. Just another point on, we believe that electric vehicles will be a part of this, a small part of it probably to begin with. We are coupling that with investments in manufacturing, in-state manufacturing. We think the key to all this is in-state development, in-state jobs. And we're investing in companies like Tesla through workforce training, training the former NUMMI workers who, at that plant that was shut down by Toyota and General Motors, to now make electric vehicles. Innovative technology, supply chain entirely in California, not spread throughout the world, and that this is the approach that we think is the way to go for manufacturing.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. I'd like to direct this question to Ms. Rothrock. How will the higher transportation costs, if that's what happens, impact manufacturing and transportation in the state?
Well, there's the obvious way is, of course, higher costs increase the cost of shipping, bringing in supplies, delivering goods, all the logistics, wage pressure from workforce needing to pay higher prices in order to get to work and back, et cetera, et cetera. But the larger cost or impact is the uncertainty around the cost. And listening to this debate, it just sort of highlights that if you were somebody totally outside of this business and you were just looking at doing a manufacturing investment in something totally unrelated to energy development, and you were looking at California, you were trying to figure out in your spreadsheet what kind of costs you were going to put into that spreadsheet to identify your costs going forward for the next 10 to 20 years, because these investments are for the long term, you'd put a big red bright question mark here. And you said, what are these people doing? Well, I can't put a number there yet, but it seems like it's going to be high. So you kind of put high question mark. You're going to put that along a lot of different elements in California. This isn't the only thing that's a struggle for us. So that uncertainty creates a whole new reason why manufacturing might decide to take a pass, at least for the next few years until it sorts out. By that time, decisions will have been made already to go somewhere else. And just quickly, we have a real opportunity here because, as you may have heard, there's some inshoring going on with manufacturing, and that the U.S. is now seeing a kind of a resurgence. And we've got an opportunity to capture some of that, and we think we ought to capture our fair share. But these uncertainties and the CEQA challenges, et cetera, are going to kind of encourage people to go, well, let's just fly over California and hit the Midwest or somewhere else where things are a little bit more clear.
I have one more question, and we'll go to the audience. I think it was mentioned, RFS2, I mean, it's out there as the national fuel standard. I think one of the shortcomings that was mentioned was the lack of cellulosic ethanol and the fact that we basically maxed out the amount of corn ethanol that we can use. But there are other lessons to be learned from the RFS2. I mean, what I've seen and have been concerned about is the extent of fraud in the trading system that costs tens of millions of dollars. And I don't know how many people know, but we are now exporting distillate in record volumes that we haven't seen since 1950. And part of that, certainly not all, has been incentives to not be an obligated party under RFS2, which allows the refiners to actually export the material without then having to buy the RINs or the, in this case, the credit that we're talking about. Have we looked at the RFS2 and the shortcomings when we've been talking about the new low carbon fuel standard?
Well, and of course, one is volume-based and one is intensity-based, but so they're different in that regard. But certainly there's lots of lessons to be learned from RFS2 in the context that it's a regulation whose compliance ability is quite flawed. And so then people behave in ways that they have to remain economic. And what we worry about with RFS2, similarly we worry about the low carbon fuel standard, is this idea that a program's designed that you can't comply because the volumes are not available, and therefore your only option is to pay to have a waiver. And so that to me is just ludicrous, because it's basically having to comply with a regulation that's flawed in a way that's not economic at all and just raises the price of fuel. So we've heard rumors of that with the low carbon fuel standard as a potential way to comply would be at that point in time you just either purchase credits or you just pay into an alternative compliance program, which doesn't solve the problem. And so that's the lesson I think we have to be very careful of, versus taking an approach, and I think some of the frustration we feel as an industry is we've suggested many ways to have the program be able to sustain itself and minimize cost, and many of those just don't seem to ever be able to be put into place. And the obvious one we started with was diesel. Diesel's a great fuel for climate change reasons, very efficient, so we said, well, why don't we start with gasoline, because gasoline's going to be really tough, and diesel can help us comply in the short term. Not acceptable, so we have requirements for both. We talked about crude shuffling, high carbon intensity crude oil. The senator mentioned biofuel shuffling. We also have crude shuffling that's going to be an unintended consequence of this regulation, and it will limit the ability of refiners to select their best, most economic barrel to refine and make transportation fuels. We suggested putting that off. That didn't happen either. And then the last one is we suggested allowing, if you're going to have a cap and trade program and credits being generated, allow those credits to help you comply with the low carbon fuel standard. And of course, that's not allowed that way. You can generate low carbon fuel credits and do the other way, but not vice versa. So they're just little things like that that seem to have been fairly reasonable, not intended to say we'd never look at them, but to do it in a way that takes care of some of those, I think, unintended consequences that you're mentioning on programs that get designed early on without the knowledge of knowing what those impacts are.
If I could,
Mr. Ghana?
if I could take that question a different direction, I'm not really going to weigh in on the RFS2 as a volumetric standard because it's obviously different than the low carbon fuel standard, but it did provide us a couple of lessons that I think were utilized by the Air Resources Board in designing the regulation. Number one is it, of course, provided the backdrop for the use of life cycle accounting as a scientific method for creating a regulation. The use of the FASM and the FAPRI model by EPA really kind of laid the groundwork for looking at upstream emissions, indirect emissions, as a way that you can judge different fuels differently. Second, by the development of the RIN system, it allowed for a tracking of fuels from source to final point of utilization, so you can figure out, where did this fuel come from? Did it come from an old, inefficient ethanol plant that was built in the late 80s, early 90s, or did it come from one that was built last year that's made a significant number of incremental improvements that's reduced the life cycle carbon intensity? And what we found when EDF looked at the data about fuels that were coming from newer ethanol plants, ones that use the best technology versus ones that were older, you can get a 20 to 30% reduction in the life cycle carbon intensity of a fuel just based on where you make it from and how you make it. Traditional corn ethanol applies. And so we think that that's an important lesson, is that you can track fuels and you can treat different fuels differently on a science-based level. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. I'd now like to open it up to the audience for questions. We have two folks out there with microphones. We have a question here.
Yeah, Chuck White with Waste Management. Really appreciate you putting on this symposium today. It's really going to be helpful, and I'm really here to look for a solution. Waste Management, what I work for, we have a nationwide fleet of about 20,000 heavy-duty vehicles, but we're in the process of converting that fleet to natural gas from diesel with a savings of about 25% in carbon intensity. And we're also in the process of building bio-LNG and other types of bio-CNG plants to convert the waste stream into low carbon renewable fuel. We have about a 13,000 gallon per day facility at Altamont Landfill in the Bay Area, producing virtually the lowest carbon fuel being produced in California today. More of those can be built, but our problem is, well, the good news is the cost of natural gas is so low now that it really makes sense to convert our fleet to natural gas, which we're going to be doing over some time. By the year 2020, we hope to have about 80% of our fleet converted. But the problem with the low price of natural gas is it makes production of bio natural gas very, very difficult. It's very hard to do that. We have one plant at Altamont that we're producing 13,000 gallons a day. We'd like to build a second one. We'd like to build a third one. We'd like to build more of these kinds of facilities in California. But we can't do that based on the fuel price alone. We have to get value from low carbon fuel standard and from the RFS2. The prices we're able to get today for low carbon fuel standard and RFS2 make it economically feasible to build a second, third, and fourth plant. But the problem is the financial industry doesn't believe that these programs are going to exist in their current framework, as we've heard today, because of various challenges. So you can't base this income over the 5 to 10 year period it takes to pay back the capital cost of this plant. So my mission is to try to figure out a way we can stabilize these programs, make them dependable, make them reliable as a way to supplement the cost of the fuel going forward. And I'm afraid I haven't heard so far today any encouraging news in that regard because of problems with Interstate Commerce Clause and other lawsuits. We need to find a way, and we're not going to invest in more of these facilities. The technology is here. We can build it. It's more expensive than the cost of fossil fuel, but we need to stabilize these supplementary programs so you can go to the bank and depend upon them as a revenue stream. And that's more of a statement than a question, I guess, but I'd like to work together to find a way to stabilize these programs so we can rely on them as a funding source. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd just like to recognize Chuck and Waste Management. They're members of our advisory committee for Fueling California.
They say, build it and they will come. That's what we say at UPS, build it and they will come. From LNG, CNG, when the governor Schwarzenegger says, I'm going to build a hydrogen highway, we built 2 hydrogen vehicles to come into the state of California, but it never was built. Infrastructure is key for any corporation to come with their vehicles to continue on. Incentives are key. An LNG vehicle, a big rig, from $90,000 to $120,000, but to go LNG, it's over $200,000. We need incentives, but build it, and that's to everybody. Build it, and we will come. And you'll find more people that will come up with all fuel vehicles that will do it. Engine manufacturers on biodiesel, 5%. If you go 10% or higher, guess what? Your warranty's done. Work with them. Build it. We will come. That's my statement.
Thank you, Bruce.
Could I comment on that just real quick? you won't find someone who doesn't like to build things more than me. I loved being on a county board of supervisor because, see, we would find a problem and you go build it. I loved filling potholes. I'm frustrated in Sacramento. I'm not frustrated, I'm excited about changing the current siting and permitting process. We have laws in the state of California. It's the only state in the union where you can meet the law, exceed the law, but still get sued and your project be held up. We need the working man, working woman's defense fund, to kind of spin off some of my friends, to see to it that we're able to build again. To your point from Waste Management, I have a little bill that I'd like you to look at that would incentivize, even if you look at waste facilities, not just your own throughout the state, they're looking to take the methane and convert it, but the margin is so close right now, we're looking, my question is, the RINs, the formulas were coming out, the question we also should be asking is, how are we spending the money that's generated? We have made a fundamental decision. If you pollute in California, you're going to pay for it. Where's that money going? And that money and the expenditures of those funds should be directly in line with the priorities and the goals of the state. That's where there's a disconnect, and we need to connect those dots.
Well, thank you. I really can't take any more questions, otherwise you don't get a break. So I'd like to thank the panel for the passionate, engaging discussion.